The woman took a sip of her iced lavender latte and smiled while the chainsaw cut through a 100-year-old cedar tree my grandfather planted with his bare hands after coming home from the war, and I think that was the exact moment I decided to give away almost my entire ranch to a native tribe instead of leaving a single acre behind for people like her. My son Caleb was standing next to me when the tree finally cracked and fell, slow at first, then all at once, crashing across the old stone marker my grandfather set there back in 1926, and the woman actually raised her cup like she was celebrating something. That was the part one still can and oppos, to get over. Not the lawsuit, not the threats, not even the insults later on. It was the little toast. Like she thought she and oppos, D1. Like the valley had finally become hers. My name in oppos, S. Russell Mercer, I and oppos, am 58 years old. And until last fall I owned a little over 2,400 acres outside Alder Ridge, Montana, up near the Bitterroot Range where the winters come hard and the people either learn patience or leave. My family had been on that land for almost a century, though truth be told, it was never really ours to begin with. My grandfather knew that. Took him a few years to understand it, but once he did, it changed the way he treated the place. He came over from Kentucky in 1924 with 2 horses, a widowed mother, and $43 in his pocket, bought a bankrupt cattle spread from a railroad auction, and spent the rest of his life trying to deserve it. Back then nobody talked much about where land came from, but one summer an old Salish elder rode onto the property and told my grandfather what had happened there before any fences existed, before the railroads, before the county maps and tax parcels and property lines. Grandpa listened. Then that night, he wrote a sentence in the margin of his Bible that nobody saw until after he died. One day, if the chance ever comes, help the people come home. My father carried that sentence around like a secret his whole life, and eventually it landed with me. Funny how family promises work. They dawn and oppos. T really asked permission before settling into your bones. My wife Elena understood that better than anybody. She passed from pancreatic cancer 6 years ago, and toward the end, she kept saying something that bothered me because I knew she was right. She and oppos, D look out across the south pasture toward the hills and say, and quote, Russ, someday this land needs to heal after we and oppos, re-gone, and quote. At the time I thought she was talking about conservation. Turns out she meant something bigger than that. Now right next to my ranch sat a subdivision called Silver Creek Preserve, which was neither silver nor preserved. 92 luxury homes built by a developer from Seattle who sold people the fantasy of rugged Montana living while bulldozing every bit of actual Montana character underneath it. They had artificial barn lights, decorative wagon wheels, and mailboxes that cost more than my first pickup truck. The subdivision only had one access road, and that road cut directly through my property because the developer carved it there while I was in Billings helping Elena through chemo. Never asked permission. Never filed a legal easement. Just did it and assumed I and oppos, D fight later. But I didn't and oppos, T. For 13 years I let those people use the road because honestly, life was too short and most of them seemed decent enough. Every January the HOA mailed me a courtesy payment for road maintenance. $2,000. I cashed the checks, waved when folks drove by, pulled people out of snowbanks in winter, even let their kids fish the creek some summers. Then Vanessa Holloway got elected HOA president. Lord help me. That woman arrived in Montana like she was starring in her own television show. Mid-40s, recently divorced, former branding consultant from San Diego, always dressed like she was hiking even when she was standing perfectly still. She had one of those Instagram accounts where every photo somehow included a coffee mug, expensive boots, and captions about, and quote, reclaiming simplicity, end quote. Within 6 months, she stopped the courtesy payments because she said the road wasn't, quote, community infrastructure, end quote. Then she had signs installed renaming Mercer Road to Holloway Pass after her ex-husband, who apparently funded the neighborhood clubhouse. I let that go too. But when she hired a landscaping crew to widen the road and tore down my grandfather and oppos' cedar tree without so much as knocking on my front door first, something inside me finally went quiet. Caleb looked at me while the dust settled around that stump and said, and quote, Dad, tell me we and oppos, we not just gonna stand here and take this, end quote. I remember staring at the broken tree rings and hearing Elena and oppos' voice in my head for some reason, calm as ever. Then I looked at my son and said, and quote, no, we and Oppos. Regis gonna do something she doesn't and Oppos. TC coming, end quote. The funny thing about anger, real anger anyway, is that it doesn't and Oppos, T always show up loud. Sometimes it just settles into a man quietly, like snow collecting on fence posts overnight. The next morning I walked out to the stump before sunrise with a cup of burnt coffee and my old cattle dog Boone trailing behind me. And I stood there staring at those fresh rings in the cedar trunk thinking about my grandfather planting that tree with a shovel he and Oppos, D carried home from Europe. Trees do something strange to people out west. You watch one stand there your entire life, and eventually you stop seeing it as wood. It becomes proof that time actually happened. Vanessa Holloway never understood that. To her it was landscaping. To me it was memory. Around 8 that morning my attorney called me back. Her name was Diane Keller, sharpest land use attorney in western Montana, and mean as a rattlesnake when somebody tried bullying her clients. She listened while I explained the tree, the road widening, the renamed signs, all of it. And after about 30 seconds of silence she said, and quote, Russell, please tell me you kept the HOA payment records, end quote. I laughed so hard coffee almost came through my nose. End quote. Diane, I keep receipts from feed stores and coffee cans from 1998, end quote. End quote. Good, end quote. She said, end quote. Because unless California lady suddenly went to law school, she just destroyed her own easement argument, end quote. That afternoon Caleb helped me haul down 6 banker boxes from the loft above the barn office. We found every single check Silver Creek Preserve had mailed me over 13 years, every memo line saying road access contribution or annual courtesy road use. Caleb spread them across the kitchen table while Diane reviewed scanned copies over email. By evening she called back sounding downright cheerful. End quote. Russell, they Don and Oppos. T have a prescriptive easement. Not even close. Those checks prove permission. Permission kills adverse use. End quote. Now here in Oppos. That's where things get interesting, because most folks assume revenge stories are about winning arguments. They and Oppos, not. The best ones are about letting arrogant people walk themselves directly into consequences they created with their own hands. Vanessa Kuden and Oppos, T stop escalating. That woman treated conflict like cardio. 3 days later, she hosted an HOA meeting in the subdivision clubhouse and apparently spent 40 minutes talking about me like I was some bitter old cowboy villain standing in the way of progress. One of the residents recorded it and sent the audio to Caleb, who sat on my porch grinning while we listened. Vanessa actually said, and quote, men like Russell Mercer believe ownership gives them emotional authority over everyone around them, end quote. Caleb paused the recording and looked at me, end quote. Dad, what the hell does emotional authority even mean, end quote, end quote. No clue, son. Sounds expensive though, end quote. But buried underneath all her nonsense was one dangerous thing. Vanessa genuinely believed the valley belonged to whoever had the most confidence. That and Oppos. It's a surprisingly common disease these days. A week later she crossed another line. I was in town grabbing hydraulic fluid when she cornered me outside the post office in front of half the county. She had on some cream-colored mountain jacket that probably cost more than my horse trailer payment, and one of those fake sympathetic smiles people practice in mirrors. End quote. Russell, end quote. She said loud enough for everybody nearby to hear, end quote. I do hope you and Oppos eventually able to move on from your wife and Oppos, as passing. Sometimes grief makes people territorial, end quote. The whole sidewalk went quiet. I mean dead quiet. Even old Marty Jensen stopped loading feed bags into his truck. Now I could and Oppos, VE exploded right there. Lord knows I wanted to. But something about the way she said Elena and Oppos' name, like my marriage was some emotional inconvenience she needed to navigate around. It cooled me off instead. I just nodded, bought my stamps, and walked out. Then I sat in my truck for about 2 minutes writing down everything she and Oppos D said in a little black notebook I keep in the glove compartment. Date, time, witnesses. My father taught me that trick years ago. He used to say, end quote, the calm man with notes usually beats the loud man with opinions, end quote. Smartest thing he ever taught me besides how to spot a sick calf. That same week Vanessa and Oppos' contractors started dumping gravel too close to Dry Creek. which runs through the lower pasture before feeding into protected trout habitat downstream. I drove out there at dusk and watched muddy runoff sliding right into the water after a rainstorm. Took pictures, filmed video, sent it all to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks and the county environmental office before I even finished dinner. By Friday morning, a state inspector showed up in a green truck carrying a clipboard and looking irritated before he and Oppos D even stepped out of the cab. By Monday, Silver Creek Preserve got hit with a stop work order and potential fines that made their HOA board start sweating through their fleece vests. Vanessa completely lost her mind after that. Started posting cryptic Instagram videos talking about, and quote, local intimidation campaigns, and quote, old money ranch politics, end quote. Lady, my truck had 3 different colored doors and my kitchen ceiling leaked every spring. There was no old money anywhere near me. But while all that chaos kept her distracted, something else had already started moving underneath the surface. About 18 months before the cedar tree incident, I and Oppos D been quietly talking with the Bitterroot Tribal Heritage Council through a conservation nonprofit Elena used to volunteer with. The Salish and Kootenai tribes had been searching for a large connected parcel near Alder Ridge for habitat restoration and youth programs. Clean water, migration corridors, meadowland. The kind of property almost impossible to assemble anymore because developers carved everything into 5-acre lifestyle lots. My ranch checked every box. I and Oppos D been thinking about it for years. If I and Oppos am being honest. Elena planted the seed before she died, and once a thought like that takes root, it doesn't and Oppos T really leave you alone. After Vanessa cut down that tree, the decision finally stopped feeling hypothetical. One night, Caleb and I sat on the porch listening to coyotes raise hell out past the ridge while I told him the whole thing. The possible sale, the conservation transfer, the tribal partnership, all of it. He just stared at me for a long minute with his beer halfway to his mouth. End quote. Dad, you and Oppos re-talking about selling almost everything. End quote. End quote. Yep. End quote. End quote. To the tribe. End quote. End quote. Yep. End quote. End quote. Including the access road. End quote. I took a sip of whiskey and nodded. Caleb leaned back in his chair so hard I thought the legs might snap. End quote. Jesus Christ. End quote. Then after another minute he started laughing. Not nervous laughing either. Genuine impressed laughing. End quote. Vanessa Holloway has absolutely no idea what and Oppos S headed toward her, does she? End quote. End quote. Not a clue. End quote. End quote. When were you planning on telling her? End quote. End quote. I wasn't Oppos T. End quote. He looked out across the pasture toward the subdivision lights blinking against the foothills and shook his head slowly. End quote. Mom wouldn't Oppos V loved this. End quote. That one hit harder than I expected. Because he was right. Elena would and Oppos VE hated the conflict but loved the ending. She believed land remembered how people treated it. Always said you could feel when a place had been respected versus consumed. And Silver Creek Preserve, well, it had consumed everything around it. The following Thursday, Caleb drove with me to a meeting at the Tribal Council office down in Ravalli County. Small cedar building, old photographs on the walls, coffee strong enough to remove paint. That and Oppos S where we met Naomi Red Elk, director of the Restoration Council, and probably the calmest, dangerous person I and Oppos V ever known. She listened while I explained the property boundaries, the water rights, the subdivision access issue, all of it. Never interrupted once. Then finally she folded her hands and asked, end quote, Russell, why now? End quote. I thought about lying for politeness' sake, but decided against it. End quote. Because a woman from San Diego cut down my grandfather and Oppos S tree and renamed my road after her ex-husband. End quote. Naomi stared at me for maybe 3 seconds, then laughed so hard coffee nearly came out her nose. End quote. Well, end quote. She said, wiping her eyes, end quote. That and Oppos S the most honest land negotiation opener I and Oppos V heard in 20 years, end quote. Then her face softened a little. End quote. And your wife? End quote. That part got quieter. I told her about Elena. About the meadow. About wanting the land to heal someday. Naomi nodded slowly like she and Oppos D heard that sentence before from people older than both of us. End quote. Some places wait a long time for folks to do the right thing, end quote, she said, end quote. Maybe your family finally got tired of making them wait, end quote. On the drive home, Caleb was unusually quiet until we hit the ridge overlooking the ranch. Then he finally said, end quote, Dad, when this deal closes, that subdivision is gonna panic, end quote. I kept my eyes on the road, end quote. No, son, end quote. I said, end quote. When this deal closes, they and Oppos, we gonna understand, end quote. Closing day landed on a Tuesday morning cold enough to bite through denim. I woke up before dawn and found Caleb already sitting in my kitchen wearing his old fire department sweatshirt, drinking coffee in the dark like he hadn't and Oppos. T really slept either. He and Oppos, D laid my father and Oppos. S will coat over the chair beside him without saying a word. That about broke me right there. Men in my family aren't and Oppos. T exactly built for emotional conversations, so we mostly communicate through small gestures and pretending not to notice them. I put the coat on, grabbed the folder from the counter, and we drove into Alder Ridge while the sun started bleeding orange across the mountains. Funny thing is, the world looked completely normal that morning. Cows in the fields, frost on the fences, school buses running their routes. Meanwhile, one of the biggest land transfers in county history was about 3 hours away from detonating an entire HOA. We signed the final papers at 9:17 inside the county records office. Just me, Caleb, Diane Keller, Naomi Red Elk, 2 tribal council members, and an elderly Salish man named Arthur Grey Horse who must and Oppos. VE been close to 90. Arthur barely spoke the entire morning. He just stood near the window with his cane watching snow drift outside until the very end. Then once the final signature hit the page, he walked over slowly and rested one hand on the paperwork. He said something quietly in Salish I didn't and Oppos, T understand. Naomi translated after a moment. End quote. He said the valley remembers who carried it long enough to return it. End quote. I had to clear my throat before I answered because suddenly my chest felt too tight to breathe right. Caleb squeezed my shoulder once. That was all either of us trusted ourselves to do. By noon, the Bitterroot Tribal Heritage Council officially owned almost everything except the 40 acres around my house and Elena and Oppos' ridge. Included in that transfer, naturally, was the subdivision access road Vanessa Holloway had spent 2 years pretending already belonged to her community. Now here in Oppos, the part people online always ask me about. They want to know if I warned her. If I gave the HOA some kind of heads up. Truthfully, no. Because for 14 years all I ever asked from those people was basic respect, and Vanessa mistook kindness for weakness every single time it was offered. So at exactly 1:15 that afternoon, a tribal land officer and a county deputy drove into Silver Creek Preserve and hand-delivered formal notice that the road crossing tribal property would require a negotiated licensing agreement within 30 days or access would legally terminate. Caleb and I were back at the ranch when it happened. We were standing near the barn replacing hinges on an old tack cabinet when my phone started vibrating like it wanted to escape my pocket. Unknown numbers. HOA board members. Local reporters. Somebody from Denver for some reason. I ignored every single call. About 20 minutes later, Caleb glanced toward the driveway and started grinning. End quote. Well, end quote. He said slowly, end quote. Here comes trouble, end quote. Vanessa and Oppos' white Range Rover came flying up the gravel road so fast, she nearly lost control hitting the cattle guard. She jumped out before the engine even stopped running, still wearing yoga clothes and giant sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. I and Oppos' never seen a human being look so perfectly arranged and completely unhinged at the same time. End quote. You sold the land? End quote. She yelled before she and Oppos' even reached the porch. End quote. To a tribal council? End quote. Boone, my old cattle dog, immediately stood up beside me growling low in his chest. I scratched behind his ears and kept my voice calm. End quote. Afternoon, Vanessa. End quote. She marched right up to the fence line stabbing papers around in the air. End quote. You blindsided an entire community. End quote. End quote. No ma and Oppos. End quote. It stopped being about the tree when you started acting like everybody else in this valley was temporary except you. End quote. Vanessa looked at him like she and Oppos' only just realized other human beings existed nearby. Then she turned back toward me. End quote. Do you have any idea what you and Oppos V done to property values? End quote. I remember looking past her toward the foothills where snow was settling across the meadow Elena loved most, and thinking how strange priorities can become once money gets involved. End quote. Vanessa, end quote. I said finally, end quote. My grandfather planted that cedar tree the year he learned this land didn't and Oppos T really belonged to him. Took my family nearly 100 years to finish understanding what he meant. End quote. She stared at me blankly because people like Vanessa hear history but only process inconvenience. Then she tried one last thing. Her voice softened. End quote. Russell, surely reasonable people can work something out here. End quote. And there it was. The part that still makes me laugh sometimes. Because after 2 years of insults, lawsuits, trespassing, environmental violations, social media attacks, and cutting down a century-old tree, suddenly she wanted reasonable. I leaned against the fence and nodded slowly. End quote. Actually, the tribe already offered a solution. End quote. End quote. What solution? End quote. End quote. Annual access licensing fees. Environmental protections for the creek. Removal of the Holloway Pass signs. Formal acknowledgement that your subdivision sits on tribal homeland. End quote. Her face changed right there in front of us. Not anger this time. Humiliation. Because deep down Vanessa finally understood the one thing she and Oppos D spent years avoiding. She was never the main character in this valley. None of us were. She drove away without another word. House went up for sale 2 months later. Last I heard, she moved outside Scottsdale and started some kind of luxury wellness consulting business. Silver Creek Preserve still exists, though. Different HOA board now. Better people mostly. The tribal council granted permanent road access after the residents apologized publicly and agreed to restoration funding for Dry Creek. Kids fish there again now. Last spring, they reintroduced native cutthroat trout upstream. Caleb ended up falling for Naomi and Oppos S. niece during one of the restoration projects, which honestly feels exactly like the kind of ending Elena would and Oppos V arranged herself if she and Oppos D had the chance. And that cedar tree? They grew a new one from clippings taken before the old trunk was hauled away. It and Oppos S about 6 feet tall, now standing near the meadow entrance with a small carved sign beside it that reads, "Some things return slower than others." So here in Oppos, that's what I want to ask you folks watching tonight. Was I wrong? Seriously. Because half this county still thinks I overreacted over one entitled HOA president and a tree. Maybe they and Oppos rewrite. Maybe I should and Oppos VE just sued her and moved on. But another part of me believes people eventually reveal what they truly think belongs to them. And once they do, you owe it to yourself to answer honestly. So tell me down in the comments, what would and Oppos VE happened if somebody cut down your family and Oppos S 100-year-old tree and acted proud of it? And more importantly, do you think land ever really forgets the people who came before us?